All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. If ever there was a channel that I feel is perfect for this kind of discussion, it is definitely the Library Ladder, and it is my pleasure to have Bridger from the Library Ladder here today for Dear Dr. Fantasy. Hello, Bridger. How are you?
Hello, Philip. This is such an honor to be invited to join you here. I mean, you are without a doubt one of the people that I think. I mean, I know I have looked forward to having just sort of in-depth conversations with for a long time. You're always very, very thoughtful in your discussion of books and authors, and I find that really refreshing on BookTube that there are channels like yours that you know have that passion for books and really put a lot of thought into that. And my one big regret today is that I have not yet read your trilogy, and I apologize,
Oh,
but I have a good excuse. I've been waiting for Alan to finish the audiobooks.
oh,
So
that's an excellent excuse. Yeah, I'll
yeah.
take that.
I actually I read far more via audio these days than I do with physical books, just because of time constraints. It's so much more efficient for me to read. I have more opportunities to read by listening than I do reading physical. But I still read occasionally physical books, especially if they're not available in audio.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
apologize that I haven't
we'll
gotten
be
around
able
to yours
to
yet.
we'll remedy that soon because the first book, The Way of Dan, is I think going to be out in late August. So we will have that out, and I'll be keen to hear what you think, both of the story and Alan's narration, which I think is going to be just wonderful. I think that if you know anything about Alan, you know he does voices really well, and he brings the full array of his talent to this narration. Believe me, it's going to be a fun one, I think, for a lot of folks. So,
The one thing that I can just imagine him recording it, and I can imagine him clipping the microphone or the recording levels because of his energy that he brings to
uh-huh,
any kind of
uh-huh.
discussion that he has. And so I can only imagine the editing process of his audio and going, damn, I was too loud here. And then having to do take after take after take
I believe he's put
because
a lot of time into the editing process. Yeah.
because it is so easy to overpower the microphone and just get
Yeah.
too into the performance, and which I know that he does, just watching his videos on his own channel,
Oh, yeah.
or when he's guest appearances on Chatting with Nuts or some of the other
Yeah.
channels, that they're always very entertaining. But I always wonder how he manages to keep his audio levels in check, because it's a problem I have
Really?
just on my own channel. That
Interesting you say that
but
because I feel like everybody that I've ever heard talk about your channel is in love with your voice. And you probably could have a career in audiobook narration if you wanted to, I would suspect.
I I don't know about that. I haven't recorded a few short stories, classic short stories on my channel just for fun. Other,
Yeah.
viewers have said, "Hey, why don't you record some audiobooks?" I thought, well, be fun to give it a shot. And
Yeah.
I do enjoy that, but it's also very challenging. I mean,
Oh, it's
just
hard. Yeah.
it is hard to do that and far more time consuming than you might think.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of respect for people who are able to put in the time and effort and deliver the really polished kinds of performances that
Yeah.
are really difficult to achieve.
As do I. I have that respect as well. Just working with Alan and hearing about what he's doing and going through, I have a much greater appreciation for what goes into making an audiobook at this point. And I haven't even been doing the work, but it is a very, very difficult process, especially if it's your first time. There's a lot of learning to do. And it has to be just right in terms of the sound quality and everything. And I think you put effort into your audio on your channel, so you probably have a very good idea of all that, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, I'm literally sitting inside a giant echo chamber because
Good
all of the
acoustics.
walls, the acoustics are terrible. I mean,
Oh,
really, really bad because
but it's such a beautiful
I'll,
space.
I know. Like I love recording in here. At the same
Uh-huh.
time, I hate recording in here
Huh.
because it's bookcases on all four walls. The
Yeah.
bookcases are glass paneled, which are
Yeah.
highly reflective.
Oh,
And
for
I
the
mean,
lighting. Yeah. Yeah.
for lighting and sound, everything is just a real problem to try
Interesting.
to get the production right. So, sometimes I get flack from commenters who are like, why don't you have more dynamic range in your voice? And it's
Uh-huh.
like, well, because if I start talking a little more loudly, then the whole recording gets very boomy because I have a deeper voice naturally.
Yeah.
And so the reverb just completely overpowers the recording
Huh.
if I start talking too loudly.
Wow. Well,
And
totally worth it because that is the most beautiful home library I've ever seen, I think, certainly on BookTube. My vote for most beautiful home library definitely goes to the room you're sitting in right now. It's just beautiful.
my wife and I, we built our house almost 20 years ago, not quite, maybe
Okay.
18 years ago.
Wow.
And at the time there was a room off to the side of the house that we said, this is going to be a library. Um, but we need to figure out exactly how we're going to arrange it
Your
because she's a
book
big reader
people.
as well.
Yeah. Okay.
We're
Good.
book
Good.
people.
Good. Yeah.
And we one of the requirements was we really wanted a room that could have a library ladder in it because we just like having that sort of traditional
That vibe.
vibe, right? With a
Yeah.
kind of a elevated ceiling where you can actually have to climb up a ladder to get to the books. It's
Yeah.
very inefficient in some ways and somewhat dangerous at times. But believe me, somewhat dangerous. I mean, this room has a 15-foot ceiling. The ladder goes up 12 feet.
Wow. Wow.
And it's pretty high up there
Yeah.
when to
Yeah.
reach the very top shelves. And it has fallen on one occasion with me up there.
Oh no.
And me, yeah, it wasn't good. The only real saving grace was that when the ladder fell, it sort of it slipped. The It didn't actually break anything. It was
Oh.
amazing. It could have
What
crashed
what
through the
about you?
glass.
You
It could have.
did it didn't break you, I hope.
Well, I was dangling 12 feet up, hanging from some crown molding,
Oh
and
my
and
goodness.
screaming, going, screaming from my wife, going, help, because the ladder was right
No.
below me. So if I dropped, I was going to land on top of the ladder and potentially break my leg. And I just eventually, nobody heard me screaming. So I did drop down and tried to navigate my feet so that I wouldn't land on anything and break anything. And I did survive,
Oh my
but I
goodness.
ended up with a really bad bruise and some abrasions. And
Oh, really? So you did hurt yourself.
um,
Okay.
I did hurt myself. And at that
Um,
point, I realized that um, the carpenter, the cabinet maker who actually built everything
uh-oh.
for us, because I designed the library. I mean, I laid it out. I said, these are the dimensions. These are all the shelves. This is what I want to put in here because I had a
Wow.
pretty good inventory of how many books I had, and it was a lot.
Yep. Yep.
And
Yep.
so I knew I was going to need extra shelving space because all of the shelves in here, just about all of them, are deep enough that you can double shelve.
Oh,
And in
nice.
some cases, depending on the size of the book, triple shelve books, which I have to do because I have too many books. So
Hey,
everything's very,
you're on
very
BookTube.
deep.
There's no such thing as too many books, right?
Well, my wife might beg to disagree with that. But, and there are times when I'm going, why do I have so many books? I really,
Right.
what are the odds that I'm actually going to read every single one of these? And I've sort of resigned myself to thinking I'm probably not going to read some of them, but I
Best
hope
problem
to.
in the world. Yeah.
But part of me is a preservationist. A large part of my collecting was because I saw a lot of these books going out of print, being
Yeah.
discarded by libraries and just being forgotten. And I thought, this isn't right. So at least I want to be able to preserve some small piece of this.
Yeah.
And that eventually led to me creating the channel, which is
Huh.
very, very focused on sort of those forgotten books, forgotten authors, or maybe not completely forgotten, but ones that aren't necessarily part of the popular discussion
Yeah.
on BookTube or elsewhere.
I
And
love that
I wanted
about
to
your
make sure
channel.
that
Yeah.
bring them back into the conversation, get people talking about them in ways that, maybe they haven't been talked about in 20, 30, 40 years
Mm,
because they're important. They're
where we come from.
they're the building blocks for
Yeah.
everything that's being written today.
Yep.
So my whole focus is trying to put a lot of those older or lesser known works in context. Like, this is why they're important. This is
Yeah.
why they deserve to be read, even if in some cases they aren't as good as things that are being written today.
Uh-huh.
There are things that are being written today, like, okay, that's better than what came before, but what came before is still important. And
Right.
it's helpful to understand that evolution of literature of all forms. And I'm speaking to the choir here because that's what
Yeah.
you do. I'm sure in your literature classes that you teach, that it's all about providing some of that historical context.
Yeah, especially as
Only
medievalists.
you're going a little farther back in history, I imagine, in some
Yeah.
of your coursework.
Yeah, as a
But I
medievalist.
love that.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
I definitely, there's a big part of my approach to teaching literature is very history based because
Mhm.
you have a harder time understanding the literature of a period if you know nothing about the context in which it was produced. And there are certain cultural assumptions and lenses that we simply lack that would have been more prominent or even the norm in, say, the 14th century. So a lot of it is first, okay, here's the context, here's how they saw the world, here's how they would have thought of this particular issue or that, and then we read the literature, and the literature also becomes a window through which to understand the past, which is a beautiful thing. So yeah, but I do love what you do on your channel because it is, I think, a wonderful thing that what we call BookTube, which is, it's not an official name or anything, but we all use it. I feel like it consists of basically three parts. One is book collecting. The other, people love to watch book haul videos and things like that, and that's great. People like that. I think it's wonderful. It's not my personal favorite thing on BookTube, but some people just love it. The other thing is book analysis. And then the third thing is it's social. It's very much social. We are all passionate about books and stories, and talking about those stories has a way of deepening our appreciation and understanding. When I talk with you about, Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, I'm going to learn something. And I'm going to appreciate that story even more. That interaction is enriching. So those three parts. And what I love about your channel is, in a way, you do combine the book collecting part with the analysis part because you are keeping alive those older stories, and you're someone you're a bibliophile essentially. That's a fair. I
Very
think that
much.
if I'm going to throw a label on you, bibliophile is probably a fair one. Do you agree?
Completely.
Yeah. So I love that you feature these often slightly older works, and I come from a background too where my approach to fantasy definitely began with much older stuff. I mean, I wrote my dissertation on William Morris, for goodness sake, who was a big influence on Tolkien. You can, I don't know if you can, yeah, these books right here are
Yeah.
from the 1890s. These are translations of Icelandic sagas that William Morris did with Erikr Magnusson, and so that's my jam really. But yeah.
I'm curious, what is your favorite Morse? I've read several of Morse's. I haven't read all of them, but I have read several, and I do have a personal favorite. I'm curious which one might be yours.
For his fantasies or
Yeah, right.
okay.
More the fantasies, although you can go to some of the ones that are not quite fantasy, but were sort of precursors to his fantasy.
Okay, the historical fantasies. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Like the Roots of the Mountains and the House of the
Mhm.
Wolfings and that kind of thing. Yeah. Um, yeah, I have a couple here. I have all of his um I'll have to show you that one too. Probably my favorite, I don't know. That's a very hard question. So I'm
I
getting four. I'm taking out
I have
four.
difficulty answering.
I feel like if anybody wants to read maybe what I would consider his best, it would be The Well at the World's End, among his fantasies that are strictly fantasy. His imagination is just in full flow in this one. I feel I would caution people to begin with that this does not read like modern
No,
fantasy.
no.
So it's very archaic language. It's not character focused, right? And it's a much more it has a very old feel to it. Like Morris was a very accomplished translator and poet, and but he translated medieval literature. So and he wrote like medieval literature in many respects. But the two more like historical fantasy. This is a terrible cover, but it's the House of the Wolfings. This cover, just forget you ever saw that. That
That's
image.
the Newcastle. That's the Newcastle edition,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. I
It's
was so.
difficult
I
to
mean,
find this.
they are. I have several of the Newcastles
Yeah.
by Morris, and I'm so glad that they were published. That they
Yes.
brought him back into print. I mean, it
We're
was
lucky they
sort
are
of the
around.
response.
Yeah.
When Ballantine and Lynn Carter did their adult fantasy series in the late '60s and early '70s,
Yep.
Newcastle sort of picked up the ball and ran with it after Ballantine stopped,
Yep.
and continued to publish or bring back into print a lot of those classics. So I'm glad you picked out House of the Wolfings. That's my favorite.
Is it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. I mean,
Actually, the
it's
first
not
one he
an
wrote
easy read,
too. Yeah.
right? It's not an easy read, but it's a relatively short read.
Yep.
But one of the things that he does really, really just, it's really neat how he does it is, if I remember correctly, the narrative, just the general prose description narrative is just standard narrative. I mean, kind of archaic. It's flowery, but the dialogue
Uh-huh.
is poetry. It's all in verse.
Ton of
All of the
verse.
dialogue
Yep.
is in verse,
Yep.
and it's so well done. And
Yep.
there's actually there's a recording of it. One of the there's a LibriVox recording of it. The narrator does a fantastic
Oh, I
job.
didn't know that. Oh, that's cool.
I mean, a lot of LibriVox narrators are not very good. I mean, they're pure amateurs, and it's a passion project for them. They love the work. They want to make sure it's available on audio for people, and so it's wonderful that they put the time in to record them. But they're not necessarily very good recordings.
Uh-huh.
This guy did a great job.
Wow.
And the verse really comes alive, and it feels like dialogue in verse.
Wow.
I was so impressed with that book. Again, it's not the easiest of reads, but it's a fun read, and there's some great sort of thematic elements in it that you can see where Tolkien got some things.
Oh, yeah,
there's
including poetry mixed in with the prose and everything. Yeah.
The echoes there continue on, and
Yeah.
so
To tell you the truth,
one of these.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, one of these days, I am planning a video. I just don't know
Oh.
when I'm going to get around to it, but I've been planning it for 2 years now.
Yeah.
Looking at those early authors, looking at Morris, looking
Nice.
at Edison,
Yeah.
looking at James Branch Cabell. I mean, I did one on Dunsany already,
Yes.
standalone, but I wanted to do another that actually looks at some of those other early seminal influences on the fantasy
Cool.
genre. And I'm going
Very
to get
cool.
around to it at some
George
point.
MacDonald, maybe.
Oh, McDonald, absolutely. Yeah, here's another one that I'd be covering in that.
Beautiful. Oh, I'll watch that one. But yeah, no, this is, I mean, Morris, to tell you the truth, I feel that for a modern audience, his prose romances, as they were called, from the 1890s have not aged especially well. But interestingly, his much earlier poetry in the Defense of Guinevere, a lot of it is Arthurian, some of it is like 100 Years War related, is aged really well. It's actually very good readable poetry, and mostly very short poems, but very just like almost like George R. R. Martin in how there's just this portrayal of sudden and random violence under these circumstances, with deep insights into human psychology. And very vivid and very readable. His early poetry in the Defense of Guinevere. I think a modern audience would more easily read that than his prose romances from much later. But, yeah.
I haven't read that, and sort of I recently made a couple of videos about Arthurian epics, and I'm sort of kicking myself after I made them when I realized, I left out, In Defense of Guinevere. I was familiar with it. I just had never read it, and I didn't bother to go back and read it because I forgot about it. So I was sort of kicking myself that I didn't include that one in my discussion.
You can never get everything. I've learned that
Oh, there are
every video
so
I've
many.
made. Yeah. But yeah, another good one. This one gives you an idea of what when Morris printed some of his prose romances with the Kelmscott Press, and this is an edition where you can see that you're familiar with this. Just look at the
I have that
images.
edition. Yep.
Yep, you
I
have
mean,
that.
it's his designs that he did. I mean,
Yep.
because he was such a Renaissance man,
Yep.
so talented in many areas. Uh,
Would you
so
like
he
to
was
have a Kelmscott Press book?
an original one.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, or an original one. Yeah, just
But
look at
I have that paperback copy. I don't
you do.
have
Yeah, yeah.
the original. I have that reproduction of it.
And then his last one he wrote was The Sundering Flood. And this one, more than the others, has a much more Icelandic saga kind of feel to it, which is why it might be my favorite. I love the sagas, and he did too, obviously. But his earlier stuff, like The Will at the World's End, it has a much more high Middle Ages kind of feel to it, whereas The Sundering Flood is his most Icelandic saga, like I would say. But yeah, so there's just a few of them. He wrote quite a few more. But yeah, I mean, he's one of the ones that we owe a lot to without, I think, many people ever having read a thing by him, you know. So that video of yours is going to be really cool. I think that's going to be very informative and helpful.
I will only be scratching the surface. I mean, it'll be up to people like you to
Yeah,
then go into far more depth than I will. You know, my whole goal is
yeah,
to start conversations, to get people to pay attention to something, or to, you know, to
yeah.
pique their interest enough that they then go out and explore it in more depth.
Well,
Yeah, I'm not trying to end the conversation with my videos. It's all about
here it
drawing
is.
attention to things.
Here's my dissertation. They can read my dissertation if they want. Yeah, where I focus more on the his saga translations in here, but I do have a whole chapter on the prose romances. So yeah, but yeah, that is so cool. And I just love what you do there. It's obviously a passion project for you, but you're speaking to people who your passion is coming through, and there's an audience here who really appreciates that, and I think it's really neat that, as speaking as an academic, where I feel like my hands are tied a lot in terms of uh, just where we seem to be heading in a direction in academia that is de-emphasizing the humanities in general. And for example, at my college, we teach a fraction of the number of literature courses that we used to teach. I can't get my fantasy novels course to run anymore because the students have nowhere to put it in their curriculum any longer because of the de-emphasis of the humanities, which I can lament to no end. But here on this platform, you have a bunch of people coming together because they're passionate about this and they want to learn from each other. And I just love that. I love that we have that. And that there are people like you who are, in a sense, leading the way because there aren't a lot of people focusing on the older stuff.
I sort of think of myself as a bit of a contrarian.
Uh-huh.
You know, when I started my channel, I specifically set out to do exactly what everyone else was not doing. You
You
know,
make very few videos, for example.
I broke every rule, or not, maybe not every rule, but I made a conscious decision to not follow the rules or not follow the so-called best practices that everyone was saying, well, if you're going to be successful, you've got to do this. It's like, well, no, because if everybody's doing that, then
Hmm.
it's almost certain that most people are not going to be successful because everybody's doing the same thing.
It's like a
And
good friend of
so,
mine who made a pretty good amount of money on the stock. He worked in Wall Street, and he retired when he was in his late 30s because he said, I have enough and now I'm going to enjoy the rest of my life. But he's always telling me, by the time you've heard about a hot investment, it's too late already. You know, everybody's already jumping on board and it's already by, you've missed the boat, you know? So yeah.
so most channels, I mean, you were sort of describing or categorizing different aspects of BookTube, and I agree with how you categorized it, although I think I'd add maybe a little bit more to it. So, I mean, you do have a lot of channels that are very focused on building community. I mean, it's a social thing. It's an opportunity to connect with like-minded people who enjoy a lot of the same kinds of books, or maybe help to broaden their own experiences with books by connecting with people who might have a little different perspective than they do. But it is very much a social community, and I think that's the vast majority of BookTube falls into that category. I think there's another element of BookTube that's more entertainment focused. I mean, they're entertainers as first and foremost. They talk about books, but it's really more about presenting a certain persona that is entertaining to people. And there may be a social element to it, but the social isn't the primary component.
That's fair.
It's the entertainment.
Probably even the biggest channels are would fit that description, I would guess.
Some of them, yes. Although it's not clear to me that all of them started out that way, but I think some of them ultimately concluded that their path for continued success involved becoming more of an entertainment focused channel.
Right.
There's a third group, and this is the group I put myself in, which are the educational channels. Because I'm not a social channel. I mean, I'm not a mass market channel. I'm not, and I don't mean to say that I'm antisocial. I have enjoyed connecting with people. I've enjoyed, chatting with people in the comments. But first and foremost, my content is really intended to be educational. I don't do TBRs. I don't do book hauls. I don't do any of those types of videos that are mainstays of the more social channels, because my channel isn't about my own journey. It's not about my reading journey. It's about helping other people navigate their own reading journey and put it into context or broaden their horizons if that fits. But it's educational, ultimately, putting all of these things into context. And then there's a fourth set, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there's a fourth set that are maybe more click maximizing, revenue maximizing might be a way of putting it. And yes, they talk about books, but the substance is really more about getting people to click and watch, and maybe not so much about leaving them better off at the end of the video, like they actually learn something, actually know something that maybe they didn't already know, and not really focused on engaging meaningfully with people in a social way. It's maybe a little more calculating. And I'm not trying to badmouth channels. There are different reasons that people enter into BookTube, and start their channels, and more power to all of them. But I'm in that third group, more the educational one. And so I talk exclusively about books and authors and genres and the history of them. I don't talk about myself. I only talk about myself when I'm on a stream with somebody like you. It's not on my own channel. I actually keep my on-camera persona pretty bland and neutral, and my pacing is a little on the slow side because a large part of my audience is international. They don't necessarily speak English as their native language. Something I learned very early in my career. I worked in the diplomatic arena overseas, and you need to speak in a more neutral, a little slower pace to ensure comprehension, to make sure that you're really able to connect with audiences who may not speak English natively.
Plus, you do know that half of them are watching you on twice the speed, right?
And I'm sure that's the case, because they're like, he's so slow.
And they just do it times two, and you sound like a chipmunk probably to half.
Right. and at that point I go, okay, but then you're going to miss some of the visual elements in my videos if you go too fast. But whatever, that's their choice. I absolutely do not talk about popular topics, popular books. The most recent releases. I don't talk about anything that's popular on BookTube.
Yeah.
Breaking the golden rule. Like if you want success, you talk about things that are popular.
Yeah. Yeah.
I I I don't make clickbait videos. I don't do top tens. I don't do, and I know your reluctance to make them as well, even though my very first video I ever watched of yours was the top 10 that
That
you
was
did
probably
3 years ago.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That video has gone the
And
rounds. Yeah.
I did see that, but I know that you are not entirely comfortable making those types of videos for
That's
some of the
true.
same reasons that I'm not comfortable making them, because you have to define criteria. You have to, you have to actually put the rankings into context for them to really have much meaning.
I feel that way, and that video is about half an hour long, and which is
Yeah.
to me very short. But I got some comments. People would say, "Why do you have to talk about all the books? Just give us the list." I'm like, but that's the meaningful part of this exercise. Is the context. Why would I pick this? Not just here. I actually got a little snarky once in a reply, even because someone said, "Stop talking about the books. Just tell us what are your top 10." And I said, well, maybe what you're looking for is on TikTok. So I got a little snarky there.
So I liked what you did recently with all of the various top tens you did, but you had
Yeah.
specific criteria,
Yeah.
the top 10 that make you cry, the top 10 action, the top 10, I mean, all of those different criteria
Yeah.
where
I
you're
tried to
actually
make
able
it, put
to,
some nuance into it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. This is my
but
attempt to meet the culture that is here kind
yeah,
of halfway and do a more educational approach to something that would be familiar to a lot of the people who love watching these videos. And I think it kind of worked. And in the end, I put them all together and said, okay, according to these various criteria that I talked about before, apparently these are my favorite authors in the genre. And that was kind of a
yeah.
fun exercise. But yeah, yeah.
Well, kudos to you. I was very happy that if someone is going to make a top 10 video, because
Right.
those are the ones that tend to do the best on people's
Mhm.
channels. Those are the
I
ones
did.
that drive
Yep.
attention, drive clicks. The algorithm loves them.
Yep.
Um, but if you're going to really put the effort into, defining your criteria, defining,
Right.
how, if you're going to weight things, certain things you're giving a little more weight than others, you're prioritizing certain types of uh, books or certain types of elements in stories over others, it's really important to know that. It's also important to know, are you focused more on the inputs into the book, or are you
Yeah.
focused more on the outcomes from the book? In other words, are you more focused on the construction of the book? Was it well crafted? Or are you
Right.
more focused on, how did that book make me feel at the end of it? And
Right.
those are two very different ways of evaluating a book. And
Absolutely.
most of those rankings on various channels don't really draw that distinction. They
Yeah, I've
just sort of
gotten into
said,
some
these are my
trouble.
favorites. I'm like,
Yeah.
favorites?
Why?
How? Why?
I've gotten in some trouble for suggesting that when you're a lot of people, like for example on Goodreads, which I do not particularly, I'm not a fan of Goodreads, but I have to be there as a published author in a sense. But the approach that actually is explicitly encouraged by Goodreads itself is you rate the book according to how much you enjoy the book. And to me, when you're doing that, you're actually not rating the book. You're not reviewing the book. You're reviewing your experience of the book, which is different from
right.
reviewing the book, which is why AP and I recently did this whole series of videos on how to analyze stories. And you can talk about, you can never be completely objective, but you can be more objective than just, I like this book, therefore it's great, or I don't like this book, therefore it's bad, right?
Yeah.
You can evaluate the characters. There are certain things you can say about characters. You can evaluate the setting. You can evaluate the tone and the style, the symbols, so on and so on. And anyone can do this. I know this because I've taught thousands of people over the years who didn't know anything about any of this at the beginning of a semester, and we're producing well-crafted analyses after a few weeks of talking about stories and what are the elements of stories that you can use to break down the story and analyze it. So anyone can do this, really. Yeah.
I mean, it sometimes comes across as maybe elitist
I've
attempts
had
to
that
talk
word
about
thrown at me a few
there's
times.
the right way to read a book and there are the
Right, right.
wrong ways to read. And there's no wrong way to read a book.
No.
Reading is good. Everyone should
Yep.
read and read
Entertainment is
more.
great, but I actually think it's the
It's
opposite of elitists because my assertion is anyone who wants to can do
Yeah,
this, can
can do
analyze.
that. I mean, it's a matter of choice.
Yeah,
If you want to do, if you
right.
and for me, I mean, how I read has changed over time. You know, when I was much younger, when I was a teenager, yeah, I read for plot. I loved plot. Plot was cool. World building was
Yeah,
cool. I'm
yeah,
getting tongue-tied here
yeah.
because the novelty of it. You know, I was getting exposed to just new experiences, new settings, new, just it was all new.
Yeah.
But as I read more, as I got older, I started realizing, you know, I've read this before. I mean, the plots, I mean, how many different plots are there? What, 20? I mean, there are, you know, those creative writing books, you know, how-to
Yeah, yeah.
manuals of the 20 basic plots that you can find in any story. And so if you accept that as true, there are only about 20 or so basic plots that every story somehow falls into one or more of those.
I mean, those things are,
Okay,
I tend to think of those things as helpful to some degree, but
yeah,
also reductive in a sense. Like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's
okay,
Journey, you know. I mean, I loved that when I first encountered it, but it is reductive, you know. But
yes,
yes, but yeah.
completely agree. But as you're reading more, you start recognizing that, okay, the novelty is wearing off a little bit. And
Yes,
so you start
yes.
going, okay, well, what else can I find in this story that
Yeah. Yeah.
can that is new or that gives me a different way of thinking about the world or feeling about characters. And so I actually, as I've gotten older, I'm much more character focused. I'm much more focused on thematic elements.
Sure.
I I I really prioritize books that make me feel something at the end,
Yeah.
feel more than just, wow, that was exciting, or, you know,
Yeah.
wow, that was a really neat concept that the author uh, explored, which I do enjoy.
Yeah.
But those were things that I prioritized more when I was younger.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm more focused on sort of emotional complexity.
Yeah.
You know, I love books, and there are some fantasy authors that do this really, really well. And it's
Robin
not limited to
Hobb, for
fantasy,
example.
but
Yeah.
if you can hit a bittersweet ending, that is
Mm,
perfect because you've got a wide range of emotional impact and feelings. You've got positive feelings. I mean, there's to some degree a happy ending. You know, the heroes have maybe mostly prevailed. They've overcome whatever obstacles or many of the obstacles that were put in their path. They're there's that feeling of triumph and satisfaction and growth in a character, you know, however they've, you know, matured over the arc of the story. All of that's great, but there's also loss, there's also tragedy, there's also,
look
you
at
know, a
the ending of Lord of the
sadness and
Rings.
grief. And
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, I love the ending of the Lord of the Rings, even though structurally it kind of has some problems. You know, it's been discussed to death, but and I did have some issues with it even when I was reading it back when I was 11.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that farewell between Frodo and Sam
Yeah.
was really, really gripping for an 11-year-old. And
Yeah.
that was not
Yeah.
normal for me to have that kind of a reaction to a book.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other books. Watership Down, one of my all-time favorites, is just such a powerfully emotional book.
It
And I
is.
love that. And there are, again, many, 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 many others like that. And those are the ones that now I'm drawn to more
Yeah.
than others.
Well, speaking of 11-year-old Bridger, I think it's time for our standard question on the channel, which is going on the theory that you are what you read, Bridger. What are some of the formative reads of your life that might explain to someone who you are? In other words, if you had to tell someone who you are based on the books you've read, what would be some of your most important ones? And going from as young as you like to up to the present, what you're currently engaged in, take us on that journey.
Sure. And I am very much what I read. And I feel like I am a product of that. And I did go into probably a too lengthy discussion of that on Joanna's channel back in
Oh,
January on her Why Reads episode. So there's probably like a 12 or 13-minute monologue that I went into just talking about why I read and what it does for me and why I am what I read. So I
yeah.
won't repeat that here. But
But
if
everybody
you
go
want it,
watch
that
that video if you haven't seen
yeah,
it on Joanna's
even if it's
channel.
just like the first 15 minutes of that video. And
Yeah.
anyway, I really enjoyed that discussion with Joanna.
Well, she does a great
But
job. Yeah.
I will say that with respect to fantasy,
Hmm.
I mean, you and I are roughly of an age. I'm probably a few years older than you, but we grew up at around the same time. We encountered many of the same books, largely because, well, there weren't a whole lot to choose from at the
It's
time.
true.
You pretty much everybody read Tolkien, everybody read Le Guin's Earthsea, everybody
Yep.
read Shannara, everybody read Donaldson's Thomas Covenant. I mean,
Yep.
the list goes on, but that's because, well, everybody read the same thing. We all had this roughly the same formative influences for our early introduction to fantasy. And
True.
by fantasy, I'm talking more adultish fantasy.
Yeah.
I mean, Earthsea, for example, is sometimes characterized as more children's focused.
Yeah.
And yes, it is written at a level that is completely accessible for children. And I mean, I read it as an 11-year-old, whatever. But thematically, it's a very mature
It's
work.
so
I mean,
rich. Yeah.
you can read it as an adult and get just as much, if not more, out of it.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I I think subconsciously I got a lot out of it as a kid, but consciously I didn't really understand it as well until I
Mhm.
read it again much later as an adult. But I'm not going to rehash probably some of those same books that many of your previous guests have already discussed at length.
Well, I
So
mean,
I'm going to go back a little earlier.
cool.
Uh, in fact, it's sort of in keeping with the theme of my channel, or the original theme of my channel, because I actually started my channel to talk about children's books. That
All
was my
right.
focus. It wasn't to talk about fantasy or science fiction. I mean, I was going to sprinkle in elements of fantasy and science fiction
Okay.
into my channel, but I mean, what prompted me to start it was I spent several years volunteering at my kid's school, leading a book club for middle grade
Oh,
students.
oh, neat.
And I got very frustrated because so many wonderful children's books from decades past
Mm,
were just not being read. And they were, in fact, in many cases being culled from school libraries and school classrooms. And the emphasis was on books that were written just in the last 20 years.
huh.
And I thought, this is a real shame. There are so many really good children's books and children's books that I think, quite frankly, do a better job of teaching kids.
Yeah.
You know, not necessarily explicitly teaching them, but sort of subconsciously teaching them,
Mhm.
exposing them to
Yeah.
ideas, exposing them to different ways of life, exposing them to different kinds of people and situations, in many cases that are difficult to find today in
Hmm.
our very technologically focused life. I mean, with kids with cell phones, and how many of them are actually going out and playing outside? How many of them are
Not many.
actually, learning hobbies, skills, things that, building tree houses in their backyard, or
Yeah.
exploring the woods behind their house? I mean, there are all kinds of things that I did as a kid that kids don't do today.
Yeah.
And you
We
may
didn't
be
have the
having the
cell
same.
phone. Yeah.
Yeah,
We're lucky in that sense. Yeah.
I mean, I was of that generation. I'm, very early Gen X. We had freedom. We could do whatever we wanted after school. I mean, within reason, we had to do our homework and we had to, let our parents know, okay, I'm going over to somebody's
Going
house,
out.
or hey, I'm going on a bike ride. I'm going out to explore the woods. We're going out in the swamp area. There's sort of wetland area back behind my house. And
Yeah.
it was like, okay, great. Go have fun. You
Yeah.
know, see you in a couple of hours.
Yep.
There was no play dates. There was no, I mean, there was none of that
No.
because
And no, text me when you're there. Or
nothing
yeah.
at all. And my parents and my friends' parents, and they were all very comfortable with that. And so that degree of freedom really sort of dovetailed with a lot of what I read at the time.
Mm.
So my early reading, and I was a very early reader. I learned to read when I was 3,
Uh-huh.
and was a voracious reader. And so by the time I was probably about 4 and a half, uh, I was reading Hardy Boy books.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I was reading Nancy Drew books.
Yeah.
I was all right. I have visual aid here, and I
Oh,
just
I
have to
love it.
figure out.
Please. Everyone loves that.
I'm not quite sure where we're going to go in this discussion, but I brought like 80 books or so, and they're
Oh,
all
bring them
stacked
all.
around me.
Bring them on.
Well, it'll take way too long, but I think yes. Here we go. This is the right stack here. So I loved. Okay. I loved Hardy Boy books. So you
Oh, I
got the
remember
Tower
those.
Treasure,
Yeah.
House on the Cliff. These are ones that I was reading, and of
Oh,
course, one of my all-time favorites, The Sign of the Crooked Arrow.
boy, that is
Um,
like bringing back some
I have
memories.
vivid memories of reading this book when I was probably I just turned 5,
Huh.
and sitting in the basement of my parents' townhouse that we were living in. My dad was in graduate school at the time, and
Uh-huh.
I can remember sitting in the basement while a tornado went overhead. This was in the Midwest, so
Okay.
tornadoes weren't all that uncommon.
Tornado Alley.
Reading this book at the time, and
Wow.
what I loved about it, and went on to read, Nancy Drew, Bungalow Mystery,
Yep.
Hidden Staircase. I mean, these are great.
Boy, they bring back memories.
And these are the original versions of them, as
Yeah.
opposed to the ones that got rewritten and sort of, I hate to say it, kind of dumbed down
Uh-huh.
in later revisions of them. Yeah, just to simplify the language, to appeal, rather than writing for 13 to 15-year-olds. In later revisions, they started writing for 8 to 10-year-olds,
Uh-huh.
and so they have the same title, but they're not quite the same books.
Right.
But I read a lot of these older ones, in part because my dad had a lot of them from when he
Uh-huh.
was a kid, and so he basically turned over a lot of his to me, and I just devoured them. And those mysteries, whether it was the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew or any of these others, things. You've got Encyclopedia Brown,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
even early reader type Basil of Baker Street. This is the book that was the inspiration for the Disney animated The Great Mouse Detective,
Oh,
is
okay.
Basil of Baker Street.
Okay.
Or of course, 2-minute mysteries, solve them yourself type things. I loved these. I was a huge mystery reader as a young kid, because these amateur sleuths, they had confidence. They engaged in analytical problem solving. Those critical thinking skills. That's what they put into play. Although, quite frankly, the Hardy Boys were probably the weakest at it. They tend to just sort of wander around and sort of randomly bump into clues. They weren't really applying deductive reasoning
You were just
to a
incredibly
large extent.
lucky. Yeah.
They were very, very lucky. So there's a lot of happenstance. They were fun, adventure type mystery stories. Nancy Drew was a much better sleuth.
Yeah. She
She
had it
she
here. Yeah.
actually did do problem solving more so than the Hardy Boys did. But I was huge into this. We have Brains Benton series. This actually is a very, very well thought out sort of mystery series. These were, you solve them yourself along with the sleuth. They were well constructed classics. Oh, let's see. Oh, we have my all-time favorites. The Three Investigators.
Oh, okay.
Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators. The Secret of Terror Castle. The
Wow.
Mystery of the Green Ghost, or The Mystery of the Silver Spider. These are just some of them. I
Oh,
have a
brilliant.
lot of them. These and the Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators, these were written in the 60s for the most part, at least these ones. They continued on into the 70s and 80s. They were written by an author named Robert Arthur, who was himself a very accomplished mystery writer. He was one of the most prolific and successful mystery writers for the pulp magazines in the 1950s and 1940s. And in the 1960s, he's kind of turned to writing children's mysteries. And so he wrote like the first 10 or 12 of these Three Investigators stories, and they're very good. And fun and exciting. And I think, in fact, Secret of Terror Castle, which has as its premise an old silent movie star, kind of like a Lon Chaney kind of horror star from the silent era in Hollywood, is at the center of the mystery. And I think this book is what really triggered my eventual love of classic movies, because it got me really
It's got
thinking about
Alfred
that.
Hitchcock there, right? So.
And Hitchcock. I mean, this is where I learned about Alfred Hitchcock, was through these books, and then started exploring a lot of his films. And I love Hitchcock films. So the mysteries were all about confidence and problem solving and analytical thinking. It really stimulated that part of my brain. I then sort of expanded that and focused on, let's see, where am I going now? Oh, here I'm going. And these are not necessarily quite in chronological order, because this next book is also one of my very, very earliest books that I read probably when I was about 4. One of the greatest picture books ever.
Wow.
Andrew Henry's Meadow by Doris Byrne.
Huh.
This is about a boy who feels unappreciated and misunderstood at home, and he runs away. And he doesn't run away far. He basically goes and finds a little meadow back in the woods, a half a mile or a mile behind his house. And this is in a fairly quasi-rural area, so there's a lot of open space and wooded areas. And he goes there, and he's an inventor. It's what he is. He's very creative and invents things for his family. A lot of them have a sort of a Rube Goldberg aspect to them, where you're like, that's really not a very practical way of doing something, but it sure looks cool. All of these pulleys and cables and other things that he's rigged up in this contraption. But he runs away, and he builds himself a house, and you can see a picture of it here. He builds a little stone cottage with kind of a turf roof on it. And as he's out there, suddenly other kids start showing up. Other kids who are misunderstood for various reasons by their parents, because they have a passion for something. Maybe it's a passion for music. Maybe it's a passion for birds. Maybe it's a passion for their pet rabbits. Maybe it's a passion for fishing. And all of these things, these kids show up one by one, and they ask Andrew Henry, will you build me a house? And he builds these incredible houses. And some of them are up in the trees. Some of them are underground. Some of them, I mean, he's a 10-year-old engineer.
Wow.
And as a 4-year-old, and I reread this book many, many, many times over the years, I was captivated by it.
You wanted one of those houses, didn't you?
let me see if I can find there's a couple of pictures here where you sort of get a sense of the range.
So this kid is building a community there.
Right. He's building a community of kids. So this is the girl who loves birds. He builds her a tree house up in a tree. And and this was also illustrated by the author.
Oh, look at that.
He builds a little fishing shack over a stream running through this meadow. He builds an underground rabbit warren here for one of them. That's underground.
Yeah.
And he builds like a little castle for another girl. And I don't remember what her passion is. Oh, she loved dress-up clothes, I think is what it was.
Okay.
He built a teepee for a boy who loved to play his sousaphone.
Oh.
And was, obviously disturbing all of his family and probably the neighbors at his house. And he loved to play loud music with his drums and his sousaphone. And uh, he built that for her. And so you ended up with this community of all of these little houses.
Look at that.
I
Oh,
wanted to live here.
yeah.
I
Of
I
course.
I wanted to be Andrew Henry to an extent. And so I became just captivated by stories about, engineers. Most of them tended to be boys because obviously at that point in time, girls really weren't expected to go into any of the STEM, uh,
They were not
science,
encouraged to at
technology.
all.
They were
Yeah.
not encouraged at all.
Yeah.
So these books do tend to focus on boy protagonists,
Yeah.
but there were books like The Mad Scientist Club,
Oh, yeah.
probably my favorite of all of them. I love this. It was written by an actual rocket scientist back in the 1960s,
Cool.
and it's about a club of boys who pull the most ingenious pranks. I mean, they're good natured, they're not malicious or anything, but they do these things that are just so much fun
Oh,
and scientifically valid. I mean, they actually explain the scientific concepts behind what they're doing, and
so you're learning
I mean, it
science
really
too. Wow. Yeah.
absolutely. Let's see what are some of the others here. Well, I've lost some of them. Oh, here they are. Are these them? Nope, those aren't them. Anyway, there were others like the Henry Reed series of books. I don't know if you remember those by Robert McCloskey. I mean, Henry Reed was an entrepreneur. He was like an 11, 12-year-old boy. He
Yeah.
set himself up. He created his own consulting firm. This was written back in the 1960s, I think, maybe early 70s.
Okay.
And he sets up a variety of different businesses. There's one book where he travels across the country, having all of these different kind of misadventures, but they're always they involve him using ingenuity to solve problems.
Okay.
And there's a degree of self-reliance that all of these books taught, and as well as an element of constructive contrariness,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I definitely absorb, sort of a rejection of the status quo, that
Yeah.
they like there's always a better way of doing something, or maybe we really should be questioning why things have been done this way always, because hey, I've got a different way of thinking about it.
Right.
And
Right.
so those types of books with these types of inventors and entrepreneurs and explorers, boy explorers, I I love these. These weren't fantasy. This was
Right.
other stuff. And then I read a ton of nonfiction. So at the
Oh,
time, back in the 1950s and 60s in particular, a lot of publishers really published a lot of nonfiction for
for
kids.
kids.
And
That's true.
I've
Yeah.
I've tried to recreate in my own collection a lot of those. There were the biographies, these kind of short illustrated biographies of
Yep.
historical figures, or Daniel Boone. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
I read biographies. There were the natural history and exploration ones, Kon-Tiki. This is
Yeah.
an illustrated version of the original, which was written for adults, but this is an
Yeah.
illustrated version for kids
Oh, cool.
that I must have checked out of my school library 10 times over several years because
Ah,
I just thought it was fascinating.
yeah.
Um, there were, I mean, books on science, there were books on other history. I, to an extent, I was kind of a walking encyclopedia by the time I was in sixth grade because I
Sure.
just loved reading about all of this stuff that was in my school library. All of these different series of history and science and other books were in my school library, and I
Mm,
checked them out. I was probably the only kid that was actually checking them out, but
wow.
uh, I just wanted to learn. And all of these books reinforced my love of learning. They made me, to an extent, who I am.
Yeah, and you could always see who was checking them out because back then you had to write your name in the back of the library book on that little card thing, right? And it was
That,
insertable into the thing that was glued into the back of the book, right? So
that's
you
exactly
knew
right.
if you were the last
Yeah,
one
no
to check
no
that book
barcode
out.
scanning or anything like that
Yeah, yeah,
back then. I mean, we used actual card catalogs, although I didn't use the card catalog much. I did most of my I browsed for the most part,
Followed
just
your
explored the
nose. Yeah.
shelves and
Yeah.
found what I liked. I also read some science fiction,
Okay.
but I didn't really get into science fiction until probably maybe fifth grade or so. As part of my binge on Inventors, I did read the Tom Swift Jr. series, which is sort of science fiction, although it's kind of fantastical science fiction. And it's more about the ingenuity of the inventor, even though the inventions are, for the most part, not really scientifically accurate.
Right.
But they sure seem cool, and they seem fun. And so I sort of lump those more in with that inventor entrepreneur type book rather than actual science fiction. So when my real first introduction to science fiction was Star Trek. Yeah, and so I was
Oh yeah.
watching
Yeah. Yeah.
the 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 syndicated original series probably starting around 1973 or so.
Yeah.
So I maybe 72, something like that. So I might have been 6 years old at the time,
Yeah.
and I just thought it was really, really cool. And so
Yeah.
I went out, when we'd go to the bookstore or something, and my mom would say, okay, you can get one book. So go, and paperback book. So go find one book. Yeah. I got
Oh,
myself
cool. Yeah.
the James Blish adaptations of the Star Trek episodes. So there
Huh.
were,
Huh.
I think, 11 or so. So I've got a few of them. There are all these different books in the series that kind of novelized the episodes from the show. And I had seen most of the episodes at that point in
Yep.
syndication.
There's
So I
only three, I
loved,
think only three original seasons. Right? Yeah.
right, 3 seasons, exactly. And I absolutely read these books to death. As you can see, there are a lot of creases. This is the one that I bought when I was,
It's a
I don't
well-loved
know,
book.
6 or 7. Well-loved books. So I really loved that, but there wasn't a whole lot of science fiction that was on the shelves
Yeah.
in my library. Um, but I did find some things that kind of scratched that itch. The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet by Eleanor Cameron. This was actually written in the late 50s, if I remember correctly.
Huh.
It's also more fantasy than actual science.
Right.
I didn't really encounter things like Robert Heinlein, who wrote a lot of juvenile science fiction in the 50s and 60s. I didn't really read much of him when I was young. I didn't encounter those until I was older. So
Uh-huh.
I was instead, reading things like, again, classic Wrinkle in Time.
Wrinkle in Time. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
this is actually a signed copy by Madeline L'Engle, inscribed to me,
Wow. Oh, there's a story
that
there.
she inscribed to me when I was in 5th grade, because she came to my elementary school.
Oh, you
For
lucky.
whatever reason, I have no
Huh.
idea why she happened to end up in my public elementary school. There is nothing special about it. I have no idea. She came and gave a
Wow.
talk to the students, and I have a personalized
That's a
copy from her.
prized
And this,
piece of your
this is one of
collection.
the books that started my collection. When I
Yeah.
was in 5th grade, I started collecting, and this was one. I
It
read
looks
a lot of
very well
Andre.
preserved too. Wow. So you were,
I treated it kindly.
yeah,
I also had a paperback edition that I read.
that got beat up.
One,
Okay.
yeah, one of those scholastic paperback editions you could buy for 35 cents from the book club. I had one of those. That was my reading copy. I read a
Wow.
lot of Andre Norton.
Okay.
So she wrote both science fiction and fantasy, and some of her science fiction actually has sort of fantastical elements in it.
Sure.
But lots of Andre Norton when I was young, to sort of scratch that science fiction itch. Oh, let me put these down. I'm running out
That
of
was
space.
feeding your imagination at a young age. Yeah.
John Christopher's Tripods trilogy.
Okay.
I talked about this before. One of my absolute favorites, City of Golden Lead and Pool of Fire. It's kind of a extension of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells,
Okay.
which, yeah, officially it's not, but you can absolutely read it like an extension of, what would happen 100 years in the future after the Martians have conquered, assuming they did conquer Earth.
Right.
What would Earth look like
Huh.
at some point, 100, 200, 500 years in the future? And then I read some of the classics. as a kid. I did read Wells.
Okay.
I did read some of the Vernes, like
Nice.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea,
Yeah.
as well as The Mysterious Island, which
Okay.
is probably my favorite Jules Verne books. I mean, these are the ones that I wished more people were reading today. Some of
Sure.
the ones that, as at the book club that I was leading, no one was reading these books. The teachers weren't even assigning them or even putting them on book lists. Like, pick a book from this list. These
Yeah.
were not on those lists. And so if we come to fantasy, I mean, fantasy came kind of late for me
Uh-huh.
as a reader. I mean, I did read juvenile fantasy. I mean, I read Pippi Longstocking and Peter Pan and
Yeah.
all of those. I did read those, and I enjoyed them. But for me, they were just pure escapism.
Yeah.
That's what those books did for me. The science fiction actually reinforced a lot of those things from the other genres that I had been reading. The confidence and problem solving and
Right.
ingenuity and self-reliance, all of those things, science fiction scratched and reinforced. Fantasy didn't. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, it didn't for me as a kid. And it wasn't until okay, pull this out. This will be a blast from the past for you, probably.
Oh boy.
And you're probably going to nod your head and go, oh, yeah, I completely agree with that. It wasn't until,
Oh yes. Yeah.
do you remember the Rankin Bass? Okay, let me get this light out of here.
Oh
The
yeah.
Rankin Bass animated The Hobbit.
Yep. Yep.
This was from around 1977, I want to say, something like that.
Yeah.
And
Same year as Star Wars.
right, exactly. I was a big Star Wars fan too. I mean, Star Wars sort of triggered a lot of my science fiction reading starting around 1977.
Yep.
But The Hobbit, I was aware of The Hobbit. I had heard of The Hobbit, but I'd never read it. And suddenly I saw that The Hobbit was going to be shown on TV. I remember the promos on NBC. Broadcasting, the animated Hobbit is going to be showing, and it was like this special New Year's Eve or something, during a holiday period when they figured there'd be lots of people watching it. I thought, I have to watch that. And I did. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. I want to read the book. And then my teacher at the time, when I mentioned to him that I'd seen the film on TV and thought it was really cool, and forever warped my visual image of all of these characters. I mean,
that's the problem with that. Yeah.
Part of the problem with that adaptation. I mean, I love this adaptation. There are many things I really, really love about that animated version. But I have to say, the depiction of the goblins completely warped how I viewed them going forward as I read The Lord of the Rings and others later, because it's probably not the right depiction of them. Who knows what Tolkien actually had in mind, but it's probably not what Rankin Bass drew. It would be my guess. But I told my teacher, and he said, well, hey, here, have this
Here
copy.
it is. Yeah.
And he pulled it out of his classroom. I mean, he had like 2 or 3 copies of it. And he said, here, have this one.
Yeah.
And I read it. And that was history from that point on. I mean,
I said, I read. Yeah.
This was so much better than the movie. And I love the movie, but I thought, this is incredible. I love this story. Where can I find more like this?
This is the Lord of the Rings, same edition.
Oh, right. And so I have that same edition. Those are the paperback copies of the Lord of the Rings that were the ones that I read and reread and reread. And it was more than escapism. It was introducing me to, real heavier themes, things like heroism, moral and ethical judgment, the consequences of actions or inaction, the decisions that people make that can have profound consequences, and the dilemmas that they face, whether moral or ethical. What is the right thing? How do you define what is right and what is wrong? sometimes it's pretty obvious and sometimes it's not obvious. And,
Mm.
early on,
Like
I was
Bilbo
probably
trying to
more focused.
decide what to do with the Arkenstone, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And early on, I was probably more focused on the heroic side of things,
Uh-huh.
like doing the right thing and saving the world and just, I it absolutely shaped me because
Mm.
I wanted to be that kind of a person. I wanted to, not that I have a hero complex or anything. It's just that I aspired to view the world in that way and finding ways to do the right thing, to make a positive difference, to have an impact that will leave other people better off than they are.
Yeah.
And fantasy is really what got me thinking in that way.
That's
And so,
beautiful. Yeah.
as I read more things, such as Earthsea, where you have a protagonist, Ged, who makes mistakes, he makes bad choices,
Yeah.
but he is held accountable for those choices. I mean, there are
Oh, is he
consequences
ever?
that he suffers.
Yeah.
He learns from those things, and so that is also, something that did resonate with me.
Yeah.
You have Thomas Covenant, one
Yes.
of the most complex, not terribly likable
No.
protagonists,
No. Does some bad
but
things. Yeah.
but I mean, he's just racked by all of these moral and ethical dilemmas that he's confronting and trying to decide what to do. And in many cases, he doesn't do. He decides to not act, and thus pushes the burden onto the people around him.
Mm.
And the people around him in the stories are the ones that, for me, really resonated. I wanted to be Saltheart Thumbfollower. I loved him. He seemed so wise and kind, but strong, and just this paragon almost, and
Mm.
incredibly eloquent. Because, of course, as you know, the giants are, they sing songs, they write poetry, they do all of these things so very, very well. And Donaldson writes those characters so well, even though they tend to be, as I said, they're paragons. They are extreme versions of certain types of traits.
Uh-huh.
But as a young reader, I was so happy to see that and to have these idealized, personifications of different virtues and different ways of thinking about the world so clearly delineated and put in contrast, very stark contrast, to Covenant himself,
Mm.
who wasn't necessarily a bad person, but he had a tendency to do some bad things
Yeah.
that he learned from, and he was punished for them, and he punished himself for them throughout,
Sure.
the
Com-
rest of the all of the
Completely
books.
jaded when we meet him too in the beginning,
But
right? Yeah.
boy, I didn't like him
No. Yeah.
at
I
all.
don't think you're
But I
supposed to.
loved,
Yeah.
yeah, right. But I loved immersing myself in that world
Yeah.
and the people that he was surrounded by, and I all of that really made me go, okay, this is the kind of story I really want to read more of. And at that point, I started exploring other types of fantasy, some of the more historical fantasy. Let's see, where do I have them? Oh, here we go. We won't
Oh, well.
belabor this one, but yeah, this is actually a 1941 uh, translation, and it's illustrated,
Who was the
beautifully
translator?
illustrated. Let's see, it was by Evie Sandus.
Okay.
I don't know if that strikes a bell or rings a bell with you. Um, and I the uh, um, Scribner's, the publisher, also had a long-running series of illustrated books for children
Uh-huh.
called the Scribner's Illustrated Classics. And some of the volumes, and I tried to read as many of them as possible. So I read a lot of the classic novels, again, by Verne or Robert Louis Stevenson or um, all of those that were covered in
A
those.
series.
But
Yeah.
they also that series, but they also published things like The
Oh,
Story of
nice.
Siegfried,
Neat.
an
Okay.
illustrated retelling of kind of the Volsung,
It would be
or
based on the Volsung saga, probably, but it might even take something from the Nibelungenlied. It
it,
depends on which version they're using.
it's
Yeah.
sort of a hybrid, I think,
And there
of
you
some of
got,
those.
yeah, Song
Story
of
of
Roland.
Roland. So you've got,
Yeah.
The Matter of France is
Yeah.
covered in this one,
Oh,
as
those are
well as
nice.
in
Yeah.
this one, The Legends of Charlemagne.
Yeah.
And all of these were illustrated. I
So you
loved
understand these
reading these.
things. I feel like these things are also foundational, though. Beowulf, I'm
Yeah,
always talking about Beowulf. Everyone knows that. And by the way,
right.
Richard brought it up, not me, so don't blame me.
I agree. I knew I was playing with fire when I pulled out that book, but I did want to say this was an influence,
I mean, if you
not
want to
probably a major
understand,
influence.
you want to understand where fantasy comes from
Yeah,
and what its concerns are, I don't feel like, I'll put it this way. If you want to understand the themes that inspired Tolkien to write, then you'd need to read Beowulf, really. And I mean, it's just pervasive, that sense of life's fleetingness, that sense of looking back on the past, and with a sense of loss and sorrow, but also admiration for their courage and how they chose to deal with mortality. And that sense of triumph along with that melancholy as we think about the past. That is something that he absolutely took from Old English in general, but Beowulf specifically. I feel like if you really want to understand, then these are the things that you're putting out all these very important books that for me are foundational for understanding the wellspring of fantasy. Let's put it that way.
I agree, and I don't mean to by bringing out all of these books and talking about how I read them when I was young. I'm not trying to suggest that I was some well-read Renaissance kid who understood all of these deeper themes and these books. I read them for enjoyment for the most part
Yeah,
when I
and
was
they're
that
readable
age.
that way too. Yeah.
And they were. It was only as I got older and I started really realizing the connections between those older works and more modern works as an adult that I maybe gained a greater appreciation
Yeah.
of those classics. I was reading for enjoyment as a kid,
Yeah.
not not as an attempt to make it on Jeopardy, Teen Jeopardy, or something like that. Uh, but
Hey, you never know.
and
You might
then
end up on BookTube Jeopardy on Alan's channel at some point,
to be honest, I'm not sure if I can. I might be contractually prohibited from that
Ah,
because I actually did end up on Jeopardy.
oh,
Real Jeopardy. I
the
have
real
competed on
Jeopardy.
Jeopardy
Oh,
before,
that's so cool.
and you sign a contract in blood saying that you'll never do another Jeopardy again unless
Really?
they invite you back. Yes,
Is that a fact? Wow. Okay. That is so
that
cool. I
that
was on,
was
I was never
that
on.
was many years later as an adult. I mean, and at this point, it was many years ago when I was on,
So what
long time
season,
ago.
if I wanted to look up
I have
somehow,
no idea.
no
It,
idea,
it was it was 20 years ago.
20
It's
years
been a
ago.
long time.
So early 2000s. If somebody
Probably,
wants,
yes,
okay.
in that time frame.
If somebody
I
wants to see
really
Bridger on Jeopardy, uh, lend us know if you find it in the comments.
uh,
That
and
wow.
I will say I lost on Jeopardy, to quote Weird Al Yankovic.
Okay.
Although I came really close, really
That's
close. I was the
cool.
only one who got Final Jeopardy right. I was the only one who got Final Jeopardy right.
Oh, but it wasn't
Um,
enough to put you on the top, I guess.
it wasn't quite enough, and I was kicking myself the whole time because I could have won, because there was one question in Double Jeopardy that
Uh,
uh, in the second round that I knew the answer to. I was like 90 something percent confident I knew the answer, but I didn't want to buzz in because I
uh-oh.
was afraid if I got it wrong, there was no way I could catch up and win. So I played it safe, and I shouldn't have, because I did know the answer. I would have gotten it right,
Oof.
and I would have ended up winning.
That's the one
But
that's haunting you, that
it's
question.
haunting me ever since. And it just so happened to be a question that was on a topic that I knew a lot about and I loved. I mean, it was something that I was like, this is a
Oh,
perfect question for me.
yeah.
And I got too risk averse because on the question before that, I had gambled on a book question and I got it wrong.
Oh,
And it cost me. And that's actually what pushed me out of the ability to potentially win. And so I was like,
oh no.
do I gamble on another question and put myself farther back if I get it wrong? Or do I wait and see if the leader gets a question wrong and allows me to jump back up? And it turns out I miscalculated.
Oops.
It was a fun experience.
Good. Yeah, that's
And,
awesome. Yeah. Alex
and
in everything. Wow. Yeah. That's
um,
that's really cool. Huh. Wow. So
so,
anyway, we're back to your journey. So you got into fantasy and you found a lot as you got older, it sounds like, of important reflection and building of your character through reading these books, which is something that you talked about Stephen Donaldson in his Thomas Covenant series. I love his essays, which you probably have read, I would guess, on epic fantasy. His
yeah.
assertion that fantasy is the literature of reintegration of these are stories that at the end of the journey, like the characters, the reader has found some sense of meaning, a sense of belonging in the world. In contrast to a lot of stories, which reflect our sense of a lack of meaning, where we feel lost and adrift and absurd, even. And so, epic fantasy, I love Donaldson's assertion that epic fantasy is this literature that gives us a sense of place and meaning and empowerment in a contrary way, contrary to the zeitgeist, where often we view humanity as essentially adrift in this meaningless universe. So there's been some chat lately about the idea that epic fantasy is dying, and I want to get your thoughts on this topic, if you don't mind.
Oh, I have thoughts. And I have been biting my tongue and stapling my fingertips to the desk so I wouldn't type things
Well,
in
release your tongue
various
and your
chats.
fingertips
Or
now. Yeah.
I think the premise that epic fantasy is dying is absurd
Okay.
for a variety of reasons. But that's not to say that some of the trends that people are observing aren't true. There are some trends that are happening, and some of them are unfortunate. But I think a lot of the commentary is kind of missing the bigger picture of things, you know, the broader context. So one of the areas that I've gotten a lot of training in over the years is I was trained as an economist, among other things. And so, yeah, you have concepts like supply and demand,
Right.
market equilibrium, where supply and demand intersect. You've got really kind of basic concepts like that that are very much in play in the book publishing market, in fantasy, but in other genres as well. This isn't, excuse me, limited to fantasy.
Right.
And I mean, this is actually something that I talked about a bit with Joanna back in January when we talked about literacy rates and what's happening in just the broader marketplace of readers.
Right.
It's not just about the supply side, that you have authors who maybe aren't writing as much epic fantasy, or maybe publishers who are deprioritizing those types of fantasy stories.
Right.
You also have to look at the demand side. And historically, obviously very gross generalizations. There are plenty of exceptions to this. So, you know, for people in the comments, you know, don't don't take me to task because I overlooked a specific example that invalidates what I'm saying, because I'm talking very broad trends here.
Right.
Uh,
Yes.
and historically, male readers were the primary market for
Mhm.
epic fantasy, and authors wrote for primarily male readers in the types of things that they included in their works.
And it's a
There
genre
wasn't a
that,
whole
in terms of the authors, it was also dominated by male authors
authors.
historically. If
Exactly.
you're talking just about epic fantasy, although it's interesting, you talk with somebody like Jenny Wirtz, very knowledgeable. She would be able to complicate that picture, let's say. She's incredibly knowledgeable about, you would love to talk to her actually, because she
Yeah.
knows a lot about not just what's happening nowadays in fantasy, but what was happening back in the 60s and 70s. And she knew a lot of those authors, but I think that's, as a generalization, yeah,
Right.
we can go with that.
I'm speaking generalizations. Jani's a good example. I mean, there were others,
Yeah.
Catherine Kurtz and
Yes.
others from the 70s and into the 80s. There were women who were writing that
Yes.
type of fantasy,
Yeah.
but they were more the exception rather than the rule.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at the longer term trend for readership,
Uh-huh.
boys don't read
Not
to
nearly
the
as much.
same extent that they used to. The market for books among male readers has shrunk dramatically.
Mm,
It's somewhere in the neighborhood of half the size of the book market for female readers.
wow.
I mean, that's an enormous difference. And so from an author's perspective or from a publisher's perspective, they want to maximize their readership. They want to maximize their opportunity to make money in many cases, probably most cases. So who are you going to be targeting? You're going to be targeting the largest segment of the market, which are female readers.
Yep.
And then on top of that, you have to look at the intensity of readership. And a lot of the commentary that I've seen on BookTube, it's coming from people who are very heavy readers. I mean, these are
Yes.
people who read maybe at a minimum 50 books a year.
Right.
And some
Right.
are reading 100, 150, 200 books a year.
Yeah.
They are at the very, very, very tail end of the distribution of readers. They
Yes.
are not representative of the vast majority of readers.
Right.
I mean, fewer than half of, or I should say, maybe phrase this a little differently. The median reader reads one book a year.
Right.
The median
In the
adult
United
reader, when I'm
States.
in the United States, right? So in the United States, this is based on U.S. Census Bureau survey data that they collect on a regular basis.
Right.
The typical reader reads maybe one book a year. So if you get up to 10 books a year, you're an outlier. But that's among readers, because you've got probably half the population that basically doesn't read hardly at all.
At all. Yeah.
And then you've got a segment that probably is in the 1 to 10 books a year, maybe say one book a month. There are quite a few people like that who read one book a month. But when you start getting into 20 or 30 books a year, 40 books a year, they are extreme outliers.
Mm-hmm.
You are an outlier. I am an outlier. You know, most of BookTube are extreme outliers.
Right.
And so if you want to look at who the publishing industry or who the authors are writing for, it's not us.
Right.
We
But there
have
is an
kind of our
audience.
blinders on.
There is an
There is an
audience.
audience.
Yeah.
And so the solution to the real trend of publishers de-emphasizing some of the big, voluminous epic fantasy series, they're less willing to commit the resources to, an 800, 900 page book or a series that could be 6 or 7 or 8 books long or longer,
Right.
because it's too risky for them. And the production costs are too great for them to be able to justify very, very uncertain sales when they look historically that a lot of these books were traditionally bought by male readers.
Yep.
And that market is shrinking tremendously. So the solution isn't to berate the publishers or to berate the authors.
Agreed.
The solution is to bring more people into reading, is to help convince people that there's value in reading, that it's fun, that you can learn a lot, that it's mind expanding in
That's what
ways
we're
that
doing here. We're preaching.
well, exactly. That is my goal, is to try to promote that. And that really is the solution. There is not an easy answer to that, because the
No.
problem goes all the way back to elementary schools now, where elementary school teachers are encountering severe sort of attention deficit problems, primarily with boys. Once they get to about second, third grade, they get basic reading skills down. But
Right.
once they start to transition into the more advanced middle grade type stories and chapter books, where uh, the themes are a little more complex, the vocabulary gets more advanced, um, the construction of paragraphs and sentences gets more complex, they're losing many of those kids. They're the kids are just saying, look, I'd rather go play video games, or I'd rather go,
Oh,
I'd rather go read a graphic,
video games.
rather go read a comic book. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way against
No,
graphic storytelling, graphic
no.
novels or comic books. I think reading is good. Any reading is good.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're limiting yourself only to one type of reading, you're actually limiting yourself in a lot of other ways, because I mean, I'm a word person. I love language. I love using words, deploying words, deciphering words. I mean, that for me, that's fun. It's a fun puzzle to try to imbue words with very specific meaning, and you arranging them in ways that do that. For
Yeah,
me, that's a challenge and a fun one.
it's magic.
And I think if you are reading graphic novels, for example, the pictures are doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
Oh,
There
yes.
just there just aren't as many words, and pictures can be fantastic ways of telling stories. I mean, one of my passions also is book illustration. I
Yeah.
love collecting illustrated books. I love illustration. But if you're only, I mean, are primarily relying on the pictures to tell the story,
Yeah.
you're not necessarily practicing in your own mind how to use language effectively. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Mm-hmm.
you probably see this as a professor when people turn in writing assignments, your students, and the writing just isn't very accomplished. And you would think that, that these are students that probably have good test grades, or good test scores when they were applying to school. They, probably had good grades, many of them. I mean, I saw this. I taught for a number of years, also in college, and saw it in my own students that, these were, I taught at a couple of East Coast schools that were very selective, very, very well known, and only accepted very, very good students,
Right.
unless you
Right.
played basketball or some other sport, and then they were a little more lenient in their admissions criteria.
Right.
But these were all sort of tops of their class type students,
Yep.
and most of them were really mediocre writers.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And it's because, I think, to a large extent, that they weren't exposed to the kinds of writing, both in terms of reading it and internalizing all of the different vocabulary, all of the different ways of conveying ideas in a logical, sequential way.
Yeah.
They didn't do that, and then they didn't practice it, or maybe their teachers didn't give them very good feedback on the papers they did write in school. I don't know, but it was a real frustration for me to see just how deficient a lot of these, ostensibly very, very bright, very accomplished students were
Yeah.
when it came to language.
Yeah, I have a couple remarks to make in that regard. And one is, you mentioned already, the competition with cell phones and social media and all of that, video games, you name it. So it's just, there's a lot of more claims to one's time, these that are around these days. But also, our education system is in many ways, in my opinion, this is strictly my own personal opinion, is failing. It's in crisis. And part of that is, I believe this is my personal take, but I believe that there's a kind of a corporate mentality that has taken over education, and the emphasis is not on learning. The emphasis is on getting the customers through the door and giving them what they want, because hey, the customer's always right. So if the students don't want a humanities course, they're going into business. Why do they need to learn philosophy? Why do they need to take literature classes? Why do they need to know another language? Well, give them what they want, make it easy for them to get through. So there is that element there too. And also the emphasis, this is part of that corporate mentality, is very data driven. It's very test driven. We have tons of standardized testing going on in this country. And it's gotten to the point where teachers are told not to teach, but rather to teach to the test.
To the
So
test, yeah.
students are not, in many places, in many high schools, they're not even reading novels anymore. They're learning how to analyze an excerpt, because that's what's on the SAT. So they're not reading novels, they're reading excerpts and learning how to diagnose or analyze that excerpt. And that's just, okay, they're going to be great at taking the SAT, but they're not going to be so great at the skills that really matter, So I have all kinds of problems with the way things have been going, honestly. But
I can empathize.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a couple of teenage daughters who, one just graduated from high school, and the other one is going to be a junior in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen this in their own high school, and it's a high school full of kids who, by and large, are from families that are themselves relatively well educated. I mean, they have a college education for the most part. They've been to college. Many do have advanced degrees, but by no means all of them. But there is an expectation in general that all of the graduates of the high school will go to college. It's a college prep high school.
Right.
And grade inflation is rampant.
Yeah.
I was absolutely shocked to discover at my eldest daughter's graduation ceremony, and I don't remember the exact statistics, but I think I'm getting this right. I remember just being boggled when I was looking through the program and just seeing all the list of all the students and who were graduating, and then realizing, okay, they've got it broken down by different honors that the students
summa cum
earned.
laude, magna cum laude,
Right.
cum laude, all
Right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. These are broad ranges, and because I don't remember the exact breakdown, but it was something like 15 or 20% of the graduating class, which had in the neighborhood of about 200 students in it. 15 to 20% graduated summa.
Wow.
When I was graduating, that 10% was just cum laude, or maybe 15% was cum laude, or something. I mean, it was like, okay, the goalposts have shifted here a
Yes,
good
they have.
bit, and then magna was like ended up being the top, between like 15 and maybe 35%.
Wow.
Cum laude was the top 60%.
What? Oh my goodness,
So
it's meaningless.
the average student is an honors student.
Right.
Which makes no sense. I mean, because there really was what a statistician would call a normal distribution, or something close to a normal distribution of students. It might have been a little bit skewed toward higher achievers just because of the educational background of the parents.
Yeah.
But it wasn't skewed that much, not even remotely close to that much.
No.
And teachers really were bending over backwards to ensure that their students had the best chance possible to get into a good college, because there was a lot of pressure coming from parents onto the principal and others in the administration
pressure
to ensure
put
that
on the teachers. Yeah.
the kids need to get into a good college, and they can't get into a good college if they don't get good grades. But of course, if the kid's not doing the homework, if the kid's not doing what it takes to actually learn the material, why should they be getting a good grade? And yet they were getting good grades.
Yeah.
Um,
But I
it,
do
it
like
sort of made
your,
it all meaningless.
yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's work to be done there, but I do like your assertion that what we ought to be doing in response is celebrating reading, celebrating the joy of learning and going on these journeys that are available to us in all forms of fiction. Uh, it's a really wonderful mission you've given yourself. I think that's one I share. And I think all of us are passionate who you would have to be kind of a little crazy to start a YouTube channel about books. You know, I do also think that in terms of epic fantasy, what we were talking about earlier, and the perception that traditional publishing has abandoned epic fantasy, which is not altogether true.
Right.
But another response is, which is more and more viable today. I know this because this is a route I've taken myself, is self-publishing, and I've gotten an audience for my books. I couldn't be happier. I'm even having a special edition of my books coming out, illustrated and with beautiful art, and you know, it's still, you know, if you're willing to work really hard, we're in a world now where, because of technology and because of the gig economy, you can hire a great developmental editor. I have one in AP Canavan. He's a tremendous, just wonderful editor. You can hire a copy editor if you need help with the commas and the typos and stuff. You can hire a great artist and a great cover designer, a map maker, whatever it is you need. It's out there these days. You just have to be willing to do that networking
Right.
and work hard, because traditional publishers would have done a lot of that stuff for you in the past. And you also have to be able to figure out how to market, and that's the hardest one. That's the hardest one. But it's there, you know, it's a route that is increasingly viable. And there's a growing sense that, yeah, if you want epic fantasy, maybe you should be looking a little bit at the self-published fantasy community, because it's happening there, and a lot of other experimentation too, and things that you can get away with as a self-published author you'd never be able to do in traditional publishing.
I completely agree. You know, the options available to authors are so much greater than they were in the
Yeah.
past. You know, the publishers were the gatekeepers for so long, and to an extent they still are.
Yep.
Uh, but it is possible now to circumvent those gatekeepers.
Yep.
The thing that I come back to, and you're absolutely right about the marketing. My wife is actually a self-published author.
Oh, cool.
She, a number of years ago, wrote a children's book series, a chapter book series that
Uh-huh.
she had so much fun writing. She sort of wrote it collaboratively with my daughters,
Oh,
and
neat. Oh, wow.
she won quite a few awards for the series, but because it was self-published, it got almost no traction, and
That's
she
the
wasn't
market part.
really
Yeah.
willing or able to do that intense marketing and outreach and building recognition. I mean, they were well-written books,
Mm-hmm.
but they really struggled to find an audience.
Yeah.
And the people who did read them generally responded very positively to them.
Sure.
But it was a great learning experience to go through that and see
Yeah.
what it's like to publish books and
Yeah.
do get a copy editor to go through it, and sort of the pros and cons of the copy editor. I was kind of the de facto story editor.
Uh-huh.
I was the AP role that you have
A
in your
developmental
books.
editor. Yeah. Yeah.
Developmental editor. I mean, my wife would bounce ideas, or give me early drafts to read, and I'd offer some comments and suggestions on where I thought it was working and where I thought it maybe needed to be tweaked to strengthen it. But then she would hire an actual copy editor to proofread it and fix grammatical errors, or maybe streamline the writing in places that might have benefited from it.
Yeah.
And that process was sometimes good and sometimes very frustrating, depending on the copy editor. And
Sure. Sure.
the artwork, she did the artwork herself.
Oh, wow.
And well, I should say the cover art she designed herself. She taught herself Photoshop and then figured
Yeah.
out how to make uh, a scene on the cover and design the cover in a kind of, it's kind of an old-fashioned but very creative way. And all of the internal illustrations were done by my oldest daughter.
Oh, wow. Okay. I hope you don't mind giving us the title of the book in case somebody wants to track it down. Is it something that someone could buy today?
I'm yes, it's available. I'm not going to say the title though. Sorry.
Okay.
I made a promise never to promote my wife's books on
Ah, okay.
BookTube. It's sort of a Chinese wall that I try to maintain. And
Okay.
I mean, I want her books to succeed,
Yeah.
but I don't want to promote. It's basically
Totally
my own, or
understood.
my own family's books
Yeah.
in that way. So
Totally understood. I mean, this is not the corner of BookTube where you're going to be selling a lot of children's books anyway,
uh,
probably, but
no.
uh,
So they, and in fact, the audiobooks are narrated by my daughters.
oh, wow. Huh.
My wife actually wanted me to narrate the audiobooks, and
Oh,
I gave it a try. I tried recording the first couple of chapters of the first book, and
uh-huh.
I realized this is not going to work. My voice is the wrong type of voice.
For this story.
It's too deep, too authoritative, too
Uh-huh.
just it's the wrong voice for this type of children's story.
Okay.
And so, my daughters were much younger, and I mean, it was a children's book featuring children in the as the lead characters.
Uh-huh.
And my eldest daughter in particular had a real flair for performing. She
Oh,
liked performing on stage. She had a dramatic
perfect.
flair to her.
Perfect.
And so she thought, she was like 10 years old or maybe 11, something like that. I don't remember exactly how old, but definitely still very much a kid,
Huh.
but was an excellent reader, excellent performer. She got into this homemade recording booth that I set up here in our
Oh, wow.
house.
Huh.
Had the setup, so I understand what Alan had to go through to get it all set up, because
Yeah. Yeah.
soundproofing, and sound treatments and getting
Usually
all of
it's a
that
closet, like a
done.
walk-in closet or something. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a little nook in my office, which is just a converted bedroom, but it had this strange little nook, rectangular
Okay.
nook that I
Huh.
I curtained off with some moving blankets and created some other sound treatments in there.
Yeah.
And my two daughters ended up recording the books and just went to town, had a great time with it.
Oh, what fun.
And
Huh.
there aren't a whole lot of audiobooks out there narrated by children, and I won't say
No.
that their performances were the world's greatest, but
Well,
I'm proud of them. I'm really
yeah.
proud of them for what they did and how much fun they had. Uh, really narrating these books,
Oh,
and
wow.
I'm very glad that it's over, because it was a lot of work
Oh,
editing those
I
audiobooks,
believe
because
it.
I did the editing
Oh, for the audiobook.
for the audiobooks. See, they recorded them, I edited them, and
Okay.
and my daughters had a tendency to speed. They would just, they'd get into the moment and they just start
Uh-oh.
like, you got to slow down. You have to slow down. You're going way too fast, way, way,
Yeah.
way, way too fast. And there was a limit to how slow I could get them to go. And so as I'm editing, I was constantly having to insert pauses between sentences and things to
Huh.
make it feel like a more natural cadence that someone was really telling the story.
Okay.
That was a real it took hours and hours and hours to do all of that, but it was a fun experience, and
Family project.
it sort
Yeah.
of set me up to be able to just, if I want to record a little short story for my channel, I can, because I still have that little recording nook in my office that I can
Perfect.
turn on and sit down and read things.
Perfect. Wow, that's just wonderful, and I'm sure it gave you all kinds of insights. You always learn from an experience like that, especially when you're working together as a family too. That's I'm sure there were many moments of opportunities to bond, and also maybe some frustrating moments where read slower, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there were times when I don't think my wife was really happy with some of the feedback I gave. She was like, "But I really liked this
Oh,
chapter,"
it's
and I'm
so
like,
hard.
"It
Yeah.
doesn't quite work, I don't think."
Yeah, as an author,
And
it is so hard to hear criticism of your book. It's your baby.
mm,
But at the same time, you you want that because especially from people who really love stories and know what they're talking about, a professional like AP or someone like yourself who's passionate and well read is going to give important insights. And you have to have a weird combination of pride in your story, but humility, enough of it at least to listen and realize, yeah, you know what, he's right about that section, I need to rework that, and then you do it and you realize how right they were because it's so much better when you've incorporated that insight into your work. So but it is a strange combination of pride and humility to be an author, I think.
I mean, there are authors that I read and I marvel at their prose, and it makes me wonder, did you write this, or how much
Mm.
assistance did you get from an editor? And because I think editors really can play very, very instrumental roles in shaping
Oh my goodness.
stories and just shaping the
Yeah.
style of the writing to make it more accessible. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the perhaps in my mind, most notorious examples is Stephen R. Donaldson.
Uh-huh.
I've read most everything that he's written, probably not everything, but most of the things that he's written, either under his own name or under his pen name, Reed Stevens.
Uh-huh.
And it's really interesting to me to look at the evolution of his writing style.
Uh-huh.
Because if you look at his earliest works, the very first Thomas Covenant trilogy,
Right.
he does have a tendency to get a little verbose at times, and his vocabulary does get a little bit advanced in places.
There's probably
But
more
for the most part,
tolerance for that back in the 70s too, I would say, for the most part.
maybe,
Yeah.
but that could explain part of it, except if you look at the progression over time,
Mm.
that was his most streamlined, most modern,
Oh.
accessible writing
Uh-huh.
was his
Uh-huh.
very earliest writing.
Yeah.
And with each successive book he wrote
Yeah.
beyond that, they got progressively more dense, more verbose,
Okay.
less accessible,
He's going against the trend then, yeah.
more repetitive, more uh, I mean, his writing style really deteriorated, in my opinion.
Uh-huh.
So I look at that spectrum of his works, and to me, just as an outsider observing, to me, what it suggests is when he was new and
Uh-huh.
untried, unproven, his editor
And more
at
supervision.
I think it was at Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. I think that's where he was with the first trilogy. They exerted a lot of control over his writing. They
Uh-huh.
basically made him conform to a more accessible style,
Mm-hmm.
even while retaining some of his quirks, some of his verbosity, some of his uh, archaic or esoteric vocabulary that he liked to throw in there.
Uh-huh.
They kept some of it in there, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward writing.
Okay.
In each successive book that he wrote or trilogy that he wrote and things, he changed publisher, which
Uh-huh.
means he changed editor,
And he
which
was also
makes
much
me
more
wonder.
established. Yeah.
And he had a track record at that point. He was a proven bestseller,
Right.
at which point the publisher is going, well, maybe we don't want to push back quite so hard.
Uh-huh.
Maybe we're willing to give him a little more leeway, a little more free reign to indulge his excesses.
Hmm.
And that's what ends up happening over the course of his writing. And I have not read his most recent fantasy series that he's
Okay.
writing. I've I plan to, but I've been holding off on it after my really, really, really unpleasant experience reading his final chronicles of Thomas
Uh-huh.
Covenant, which just absolutely indulged those excesses. I
Okay.
read that and thought, did he have an editor at all?
Yeah.
Because it was way too much.
Huh.
It desperately needed focus and streamlining and more accessible prose. It just was too much. I don't know if you've read those final four
I have
books.
not. No, I have not read much actually of his fiction. I read Lord Fowl's Bane
Hmm.
quite a long time ago, and I do intend to read more. How far into the series would you say you
The
got?
first two, the first two
First two trilogies?
trilogies
Uh-huh.
are very readable.
Yeah.
And I mean, the second one I don't enjoy as much as the first one. The first one for me is the pinnacle.
Okay.
The second one, though, is very good
Okay.
and expands on some of the themes in ways that the first trilogy did not, and I think does it in a useful way, in a meaningful way. And there's some really tremendous moments in the second trilogy that are going to stick with me forever. They're just great, great moments
Wow.
that he wrote so very, very well, even though he does have continued problems with characterization, that the best characters in both of those first two trilogies are not the protagonists.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the supporting characters that really make the story come alive. And again, I'm speaking from my own experience. I know others disagree, and I've gotten people disagreeing
Well,
with me on
I feel
my
like he
videos
does
that I've
that
made
on
about those books.
purpose. In the case of Thomas Covenant, I think he does that on
Yeah.
purpose.
It does. I've read an interview with him once where he basically said, and this was I think after he had finished the full Chronicles. I mean, the whole series was done, and he said essentially that whole story, all 10 volumes, is a projection of Thomas Covenant's subconscious. I mean,
Uh-huh.
it's his psyche that's being projected onto the land, which is the sort of fictional portal world that he travels to. Or maybe does he travel to him? Maybe it really was all in his mind the whole time, that this
Yeah.
is, because as I was talking before, you have these paragons, these characters that are essentially archetypes, that
Hmm.
are these, in fact, sort of the Jungian, Carl Jungian archetypes from psychology that are being projected from Covenant's mind onto the page to tell this story. Donaldson suggests that that's actually the case, in which case you
Yeah.
really shouldn't take any of the characters in the books literally,
Wow.
because they're all figurative. They're all sort of representations of different aspects of one
Mm.
person's
Mm.
personality.
Wow. That makes it even more intriguing, I feel. But yeah, that's very cool. Well, I'm gonna get to back to Lord. I'm gonna have to reread Lord Fowl's Bane. It's been
Yeah.
a long time, probably 30 years since I read it. So a while. It's kind of fuzzy at this point. But
I'm that way about a lot of books that, I want to talk about this book, but it's been so long since I've read it. I need to reread it before I can actually,
yeah,
talk about it confidently.
I mean, I have some greats that I need to get back to, including um, Donaldson. But yeah, Tad Williams. It's been more than 20 years since I read Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, and Guy
And you want to
Gavriel
get to
Kay.
his new series that
I
extends
do. Yeah, yeah.
the Ostenard
Yep.
world,
Guy
which I
Gavriel
highly
Kay is
recommend.
another one that I want to get back to. So is there too many books, Bridger? It's a problem.
Well, that was the point that I was going to sort of make when we were talking about the death of epic fantasy. It's like,
Yeah.
look, if authors stopped writing epic fantasy today, if no epic fantasy was ever written from this day forward, which
Yep.
of course isn't going to happen, but just hypothetically, if it did, the existing supply of epic fantasy is more than I will ever read in the remainder of my lifetime, and certainly more than the vast majority of readers will ever get around to reading.
Too true.
So
Yeah.
there's not really a problem with a shortage of supply.
Right.
it's so the people who are making that argument, well, I need more, I need more, I need more. It's like, okay, but you're at the tail end of the distribution. You're the people reading 100 books a year.
Right.
So potentially you might run out, in which case maybe you should diversify your reading and read
Yeah.
more mystery, read more historical fiction, read more horror, read more, I mean,
Yeah.
whatever, literary fiction,
Nonfiction. Yeah.
nonfiction. Just broaden your reading so that you're not so dependent on one subgenre.
I'm not worried about running out. Honestly,
I'm not
my
either.
my fear is I'm never going to get to all the ones I want to read, which is again, it's a good problem. But this has been so much fun, Bridger. I want to be aware of your time. You've given me already a fair amount of it, and I really
Oh,
appreciate it. This has been really just a fun discussion. I looked forward to this a lot, and you have delivered wonderfully. I hope we'll have other opportunities in the future, though, as well to talk. We had that great conversation on Josh's channel, Red Fury Books,
right.
about epic fantasy, and we failed to define what it is, but we feel that it's
Yeah,
still around. So
exactly. And I've enjoyed both of those conversations today, as well as on Josh's channel. I hope to continue these conversations. I find them really rewarding, and I hope the audience does too. I hope the audience wasn't too bored by my show and tell of pulling out all of my children's books from that for me at least were very formative.
I
And I
strongly
only
suspect you're going to have people leaving comments like, "Oh, wow, that brought back some memories." You certainly did for me. So yeah, that was great.
I I hope so.
And
You
you
know,
might get some who say, "I'm looking for some good books for my kids," and we'll probably pick up a few of those titles, which is that's the goal, isn't it? So
yeah.
yeah.
I've made a few of those videos. So basically, just I started focusing on children's books at the beginning, and over time, I still sprinkle in the occasional children's book focused video. But I have to say, they are the worst performing of all of my videos. I'm glad that they are reaching an audience, and I think the audience that they do reach appreciate them.
Yeah.
So I'm glad they are having an impact where they're having, but the algorithm really hates those videos.
Oh,
They don't get pushed at all.
yeah.
Apparently, there aren't a whole lot of children's book viewers out there in BookTube. Either that or my channel has been typecast as an adult fantasy and science fiction
That's the
channel, in which
thing.
case
Yeah.
it assumes that none of my viewers have kids, or very few of them,
Right.
so it doesn't really push them out.
I
But
fairly
I am,
regularly would get comments asking for recommendations for younger readers for fantasy, especially earlier in my channel. I had some videos with my younger daughter where we talked about, she was a big, at one point in her life, a Harry Potter reader, and the Rick Riordan, the Percy Jackson, and she's read The Hobbit at a very young age. She was a big reader like you when she was a little tiny kid, 3 years old, reading stuff like The Hobbit and Harry Potter. She was reading. She'd read the first several Harry Potter books before the age of 5. So she was like that. So I had some discussions with her, and I would often get questions from my regular viewers who are adults about what can I get for my kid. So they're out there. They're definitely out there. But thank you so much. I just thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm sure most of my audience already is aware of your channel, but there will be a link in the description to the library ladder, and don't fall off that ladder again, please.
well, as I said, the carpenter or cabinet maker who made it forgot to put a grippy pad on the bottom of the ladder,
Oh,
because
that'll do it.
it's not a rolling ladder, because there just wasn't quite space with it. The room was too cramped once we actually built the cabinets in to do a rolling ladder. So it's a physical ladder that I actually have to move, pick up and move, and it's very heavy, very large. But he didn't put any kind of grip on the bottom, and I didn't realize that until after it slipped. And then I went, oh, okay, well, let me rubberize the bottom of this
Yeah,
ladder so
yeah.
it grips now.
Oh, good.
But thank you for the well wishes and the hopes for my continued safety here in
Yeah.
my sanctum sanctorum.
That's right. And it's a beautiful space as well. But yep, thank you everybody who has watched this, and until next time.